Paul, what's the best way to pronounce your last name?
Jones.
Jones?
No, Grootendorst.
Grootendorst?
Grootendorst, yes.
No.
And Paul, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself, like why you decided to become an economist, and what drew you to, or I mean, you're in the faculty of pharmacy, is that correct?
That's correct.
My
route to becoming an economist was quite circuitous. It was basically the path of least resistance. I wanted to be an engineer, but I failed Math 100 at university, and I didn't do very well at computer science, so I was looking in the calendar for courses that seemed interesting, so I found economics, and then I took economics. And then my undergraduate advisor was interested in healthcare issues, so I did an honors BA with him under his tutelage. Worked in the area of physician-induced demand for a while. Then I wanted to get a master's degree in economics after my undergrad degree, and it was not really in health, but it was just general economics. And then I tried to get a job. Unfortunately, the year I graduated was 1989, and there was a bit of a recession going on, so I couldn't find work that looked interesting. So I went for a PhD, decided to do it in health economics, went to a place called McMaster University. Met up with some people at the Ministry of Health in Victoria, British Columbia, worked there, met the director of the drug plan, got interested in drugs, I mean pharmaceutical drugs, and let's see, then I got some data for my PhD thesis from him, and then I got my PhD, and then I met somebody who at McMaster who was also interested in pharmaceutical economics, and then he was starting up a center for health economics and pharmaceuticals. And then I got working in there, and then I met the dean of the faculty of pharmacy at the University of Toronto through my travels, and then he invited me to apply for a job at U of T, which I did, and I got it. So now here I am. I'm doing. I'm in the faculty of pharmacy. So it was a long route, definitely not planned from the get-go. Just kind of fell into it, and then I met a lot of interesting people. I see Joel Lexton on the line, and Joel and I have done some work together. And yeah, I find this area to be very interesting. It's kind of, I don't know, it combines both policy and in theory together in a nice way. If you like, I can start going through my slide deck.
I think that's a good idea.
Okay. So thanks for all attending. I wanted to give you well, I'd say the 30,000-foot view of drug pricing in Canada, and to do so, I thought the best way of doing that would be to briefly trace out the history of brand drug pricing in Canada, and then finish off with some statistics on drug prices and drug sales revenues. Okay. So can we go to the next slide? So my story begins in the summer of love. I think Joel can describe it better than I can, but apparently it was quite a good time to be alive. The federal government of Canada introduced the compulsory licensing regime, which allowed generic companies to sell copies of branded drugs that were still on patent in exchange for a royalty of equal to 4% of sales. The actual law had been on the books for a number of decades, but what the companies could do was import the APIs, the active ingredients to make the drugs, and that was apparently the catalyst. So we had a next slide, please. We had the beginnings of a generic industry in Canada, which kind of really shaped the pharmaceutical sector in Canada. in the early 70s, the provincial governments introduced drug coverage for various groups, including seniors, those with low income, and residents of nursing homes and others as well. So this was the kind of the start of government involvement in pricing of drugs or reimbursement rates or setting of reimbursement prices for prescription drugs. There was no formal mechanism for setting brand drug prices back then. I don't actually know how it was set. I mean, did the company simply say, this is what we're charging and take it or leave it? I'm not too sure. But there was no formal constraints that I'm aware of on the pricing of branded drugs. There were regs on the pricing of generic drugs, which were pretty ineffectual. They were pretty ill-informed. But I'm going to focus my talk on the branded drug sector. So then, in the early 70s as well, the provincial governments provided a route by which pharmacists could substitute generic for branded drugs, and that combined with the earlier 1969 Patent Act changes plus the introduction of these drug plans caused there to be a growth in the generic drug manufacturing sector. Many companies that you'll be familiar with today, like Apotex, really got their start during this time. They had, obviously all the conditions were right for their growth. At the same time, there was pretty heady growth in the private drug coverage. A lot of employers started to add prescription drugs as part of their benefit packages. The private plans, again, were pretty passive in terms of cost management, and certainly had no, to my knowledge, had any formal mechanism for setting prices. They, to my knowledge, simply took the prices that were listed on the provincial government drug plan formularies as being prices that they paid. Next slide, please. So things started to get interesting in the late 1980s. The U.S. negotiated a free trade agreement with Canada, and as part of the horse trading around this agreement, Canada agreed to provide branded drugs with a minimum number of years of market exclusivity, between 7 to 10 years. The next year, in 1988, the federal government introduced what is known as the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, and this is a quasi-judicial agency that is charged with regulating the introductory prices and the rate of price growth of patented prescription drugs. There's basically two major categorizations of new patented drugs: novel and Me Too. If you're a novel drug, your introductory price is limited to be no higher than the median of the prices charged in 7 comparator countries, which you'll see on the screen. And Me Too drugs prices are limited to the prices of existing therapies in the therapeutic category. Okay, so that takes us to the early 90s, and then that's when Nafta was passed. And again, it always seems to be the case that these pharmaceutical IP policies are changed around the time there was a trade agreement, and that was true for Nafta. In Nafta, the compulsory licensing regime that was established in 1969 was abolished. We formalized, or we sort of standardized our IP regime with those of the United States. We introduced what is called a patent linkage regime, modeled on the US system. Basically, that means that if you're a generic company and you want to launch your product, you have to demonstrate in a litigation that the patents that are still deemed to be valid by the brand company are either invalid or not infringed. That was a gift to the IP lawyers. It caused a massive growth in that industry. and massive people made their careers in, well, exploiting the rules to for their advantage. It was basically a massive increase in litigation. Next slide. So we talked a bit about the brand pricing in respect of the ability of governments to, pay less for branded drugs by way of using generic products. In the early 90s, the provincial government drug plans started tackling the issue of branded drug prices, and they got onto the economic appraisal bandwagon. Every provincial government started to use a thing called cost effectiveness analysis, which was a tool they used to assess value for money offered by new prescription drugs. I actually don't even know if this is the case, but you would think that there might be some price controls inherent in such a scheme. I'm not too sure if that's the case. In any event, just like the IP rules led to a massive increase in litigation, these rules led to a massive increase in pharmacoeconomics. So everyone and their dog seem to be doing economic appraisals of new prescription drugs, as you can see from the graph. Yeah, I mean, a lot of my colleagues are making money doing that for companies. Okay, so then fast forward to 2006. The Ontario government runs the biggest drug plan in the country. It's the ODB, the Ontario Drug Benefit Plan, and they said, "Hey, we are the biggest player. Why aren't we using our buying power to our advantage?" So they started to basically demand brand companies, as a condition for formulary listing, offer them a secret discount off of the list prices that were published on the formulary. These are known as product listing agreements. So the actual list price of a drug might be $1 a pill. The government would be effectively paying 50 cents a pill through a end of year check written from the company to the government. Other provinces said, hey, we should be doing the same thing, and now every province in the country has some form of product listing agreement with the brand companies. Next slide. So we've been talking about the public plans. So far, the private plans have typically been passive. They don't really, it's completely unlike the states situation, although that is now changing. There are some entrepreneurs who are trying to demonstrate to private payers that, hey, you can actually pay less if you want, if you're a bit smarter about the way you manage your drug plans. There's the former director of the ODB, Ontario Drug Benefit, Helen Stevenson, has started up a company called Reformulary Group, and they're trying to spread the gospel to private drug plans. Private plans are now entering into pricing agreements with manufacturers in respect of prices for these high-cost biologics. So they're now changing. They're now becoming more, conscious of the prices they're paying and the cost of their drug plans. And I think that takes us to that's basically in a nutshell, how our pricing system has evolved. I'll briefly turn to some of the evidence on the prices we pay and the sales figures for Canada. So, next slide, please. In Canada, we like our drugs. Our sales revenues, prescription drug sales as a fraction of GDP is up there with the United States. We're one of the countries which has a higher share of GDP spent on prescription drugs. The United States obviously is a clear leader at 2.1%, but we're not too far behind, and we're much bigger than these comparator countries. Next slide, please. Yes, so Canada's, the prices that we pay for prescription drugs, which are regulated by the, these are for new patented drugs, or at least patented drugs. Again, these are regulated by the PMPRB, the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board, and they publish statistics on the relative prices, relative foreign to domestic prices, and yeah, I mean, these are nominal. These are the list prices. I'm not sure if they have access to the actual post-rebate prices, but yep, here's the numbers. In 2013, apparently the U.S. paid double what we paid for the same pills. We're on par with Germany, but we're paying more than, say, France, UK, Sweden, and Italy. A bit more than the Swiss. The rate of increase of prices has been kept in check, owing possibly to the PMPRB and also efforts by provincial drug plans to limit price increases. So yeah, here's the PMPRB is very proud to report that their rate of price growth of the prices of the drugs they regulate has been kept under the rate of CPI growth, price of the inflation rate, at least since 1988. Next slide. And then the last figure I want to share with you is the increasing prominence of what are called in the private drug industry specialty drugs, otherwise known as biologics, or really high-cost medicines. They're becoming, they're having an increasing share of a total private plan cost as well as public plan costs. Actually, the Enbrels of the world, the drugs for inflammatory disease are becoming much more used, and they're assuming an increasing share of total prescription drug costs, which is causing some consternation and some reflection amongst the industry in terms of their sustainability. I think that is the end of my slide deck. It is.
Yep, I muted.
So let's go back to Paul, maybe. Well, I think that was perfect. That was a great overview. The whole history and bringing us up to the present. I'd like to invite the people that are participating remotely to ask them if they have questions that they'd like to ask to Paul.
I think Sean has a question.
Okay. Sean?
Yeah.
Sean.
Hi, this is Sean Flint. Thank you for that really great presentation, and you know, some of it was a reminder of what's been going on in Canada, but a lot of it was also really new. So thank you very much. So the part I didn't hear that I was actually kind of expecting was so how would the Trans-Pacific Partnership Pharmaceutical Reimbursement Chapter impact what's going on in Canada, and what are the politics around that in Canada like?
I actually don't know a whole lot about the TPP. It's the details of this trade agreement have been kept under wraps, as far as I can tell. Like, you know, the short answer is I don't know. Obviously, these trade agreements in the past, if you look at the FTA in '87, the Nafta in '93, the most recent trade agreement was with the Europeans in form of the CETA, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. These trade agreements are the vehicle that the brand companies use to lobby for changes to the IP regime in Canada. So I actually think we've got a pretty brand-friendly IP regime now. We have, you know, 8 years of data exclusivity. We have 20-year patent terms. We have patent linkage with right of appeal from the brand companies in case they're given an initial unfavorable ruling. Like, what else do they want? I mean, they got some patent term restoration as part of the CETA group deal. So, I mean,
So
I'm not too sure exactly what the heck they want in addition to that.
we can tell you because it's been leaked, actually. So what they want in addition is a chapter that would give pharmaceutical companies the ability to appeal any reimbursement price, and also require that reimbursement prices be based on objective, including analysis of a term in the agreement that refers to market costs.
Oh.
And so it provides a new administrative route for and right of pharmaceutical companies to challenge reimbursement decisions, and it really sounds like you are exactly the person we need to be talking to the people working on this policy side. We have the public sector unions down here. Groups like AARP are starting to think about it. They're really knowledgeable about reimbursement systems, which it sounds like you are. So I hope I can help make that connection with you.
Well, I'm actually. This is the news to me. Actually, I'm not aware of this development that they would spread their tentacles to the rules governing how drug plans reimburse. I mean, this seems.
It's just the public drug plans.
Just the public. Okay.
Public drug plans, and I mean, we should probably have a call. If there's time, I'm happy to spend a lot more time in this call talking about it. But I'm pretty familiar with it. I've been reading these things over a bunch of years.
Yeah.
And primarily working with groups concerned about Medicaid impacts on Medicaid and Medicare, and the response to that is the U.S. is trying to carefully construct these demands so that they don't affect Medicaid and Medicare. But now Canada is at the table, and I'm not connected to people in Canada working on it, and it concerns me that you're not. I don't know who they are, but we really have to find them and connect them to you, because Canada is now being asked to sign on to this chapter as part of the TPP deal.
But this is like, how would the federal government, who is presumably the agency or the level of government negotiating this, they don't have any purview over provincial matters like this. I mean,
so that's it's probably what they're doing is trying to carve out the provinces. That's how the United States deals with it, is it only refers to federal government level reimbursement. But of course the policies will probably be a series of policies that the provincial level government reimbursement systems don't comply with. That presents the interesting politics, is that it may or may not be a frontal attack on everything that's going on now, but it would be a barrier to ever doing the same kind of stuff at the federal level if it ever got transferred there, and it would put in place a series of processes.
Sean, we have about 10 people I want to go to.
Yeah, I'm sorry for taking off on that, but let's definitely take this offline. And
sure.
This is a very important point that Professor Flynn. I forgot to introduce you, Sean, but Sean is at American University, and he is very focused on these issues of drug pricing and trade agreements and things like that. Could we go right now to Merit from UAEM? Could you introduce yourself first and then ask your question?
Sure. Hi. I hope you can hear me. Thank you. Thanks for your presentation.
Yes, okay.
My name's Meredith Basie. I'm the Executive Director of Universities Allied for Essential Medicines. I just specifically, given Canada's link to insulin and it being now a 93-year-old medication, I was wondering if you might be able to comment specifically about the rising drug pricing that we're seeing of this important medication.
Prices charged for insulin?
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that. Actually, I thought this drug would have been, maybe there's new forms of insulin being administered.
Okay.
I mean, there's different types of insulin. Joel may know better than I do on this, but yeah, I have no idea. Sorry.
Okay. No, it's been increasing, and it's in theory off patent, but it's a much bigger problem. Okay, just curious to know if you were able to comment. Thanks.
Maybe it's just not. Is it one of the problems that has been the U.S. is facing in terms of some generics, which are low volume? There's been massive price increases because of supply disruptions.
There's no generic insulin, and there's a monopoly. It's Eli Lilly, Sanofi and Novo Nordisk that control over 90% of the market, I believe.
Okay.
But yeah. Okay, no, that's just something to look into further. Again.
Go to Shania.
Joel has a comment, I think.
Oh, wait, I'm muted.
We're muted.
Oh, I didn't. Joel, I think you have to unmute your.
Okay. Hi. So a few things. If insulin's off patent in Canada, then the Patent and Medicine Prices Review Board, as its name implies, deals with drugs that have a valid patent. So if insulin is off patent, the companies can raise their prices in Canada if they want to. In terms of groups in Canada that are working around the TPP, the main one is probably the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, which is based in Ottawa, and the person with that organization that deals with trade issues is named Scott Sinclair.
Can I just add that I mean there are versions of as Meredith mentioned, there's old versions of insulin, and then there's newer versions that are under patent. So it's difficult to get cheap insulin, but what the companies are really selling and what's available to most patients are, often there are cases that are protected by some type of intellectual property because they really have a different, they're a little bit different than the original versions.
Yeah, the new versions of insulin, the genetically modified ones, a lot of those are under patent.
There's I think we had a question from
Shayna?
Shayna, are you still around here right now? You want to?
Yeah, I'm on the line. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I just had a question on if you knew anything about...
Could you introduce yourself for everyone?
I'm China. I'm from Friends of the Global Fight. My interest is kind of on the side in access to medicine. I'm actually going to law school next year to hopefully tackle this issue. And I'm really interested in how you think groups like the Global Fund or Gavi or other things like that can help influence drug prices, either in in the U.S., which is probably unlikely, but in places where they're still developing their regulatory environment, like Africa or Asia.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear your question. Can you please repeat it, or someone else repeat it?
Sure. What do you think, or what kind of role do you think that multilaterals or bilaterals can play in drug pricing internationally?
Multilateral, bilateral, what? Trade negotiations?
Are you talking about what role do big international drug companies play in shaping drug pricing policies, or are you talking about multilateral UN type bodies?
I'm talking about more like UN type bodies, like the Global Fund or like the Gavi, things like that.
I don't think that's really Paul's expertise, right, Paul?
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm mostly ignorant about the machinations of international bodies like UN and their influence on trade, on pricing policies. I think they might have peripheral influence, but my sense is that I'm actually shocked by the power of brand companies to influence the contours of these trade agreements. I just don't understand how it works.
Okay.
Like in the European case, I'm just shocked at actually how, why does the EU? I guess they're just representing their interests, right? I guess, but it's always seems to be the case that the pharma has a seat at the table whenever these things get negotiated.
Right.
I'd like to just do more of a question about the way governments evaluate prices in Canada, or you think they should evaluate prices. I mean, it's my opinion that there's three basic ways that governments approach drug pricing. Either they look at the benefits of a new drug.
Mm-hmm.
Look at some people have advocated they look more at the cost of the inputs of developing a new drug as a basis for a drug pricing model. And a third way is that they just look at what does somebody else charge for the same product. They
Yes.
kind of do the reference pricing. But if you're based on your own research, what do you think is the most fruitful way forward for governments to evaluate drug pricing?
Well, cost-based reimbursement is fraught with difficulty. If I'm not an industrial economist, but obviously, you can think about this. You think about it for a second, you realize that there's going to be a problem with the amount of information held by the company and the amount of information held by the regulator. So you're always trying to guess at what the true costs are, and it's always going to be a guessing game. So that's probably not the way to go. In terms of what others are paying, again, problematic because you never know what they're paying. There's, as we discussed earlier, there's now two prices that are paid. One is a list price and one is the actual price. And no one pays the list price anymore. It's all based off, they all get some sort of break on the pricing. It's almost like a hotel room, right? If you look up back of the hotel room door, there's a rack rate. And then there's the price you actually pay on, hotels.com or wherever you booked it. I mean, so like these international referencing, I just don't know if that's even like the informational problems are just too great. How do you actually get information on what the true prices are? So my sense is that if governments want to want to start regulating prices, they have to consider their own budget constraints, and they have to consider, what it is that they're giving up by spending more money on the drug budget, and what are they willing to pay? I mean, it doesn't have to be the case that they have to pay exactly their maximum. Obviously, they want a bit of consumer surplus as well, but they have to consider at least, the way it happens in the past, I think, in Canada is that with the advent of economic appraisal, they have people who make decisions have had an implicit willingness to pay value for a quality-adjusted life year. That's how these things are expressed. The drug company will say our drug, compared to the existing therapy, will provide X quality-adjusted life years to patients who take the therapy. The government says, okay, well, we're willing to pay $50,000 for quality, so that will then, you can then use that information to back out the price that the company will charge. So that's one way they could proceed. It seems to be...
Well, can I just ask you a question about the dollars per quality thing? And that is, suppose that a drug, you take a drug and it adds 20 years to your life. Do you multiply 50,000 times 20?
Well, if it's 50,000 per year, yeah, if it's 50,000 per year per quality adjusted life year gain. So if it's right, so if you get 20 years, or how many years you get out of that drug, additional. I mean, if you look at the drugs for Hep C, you can imagine that they're adding quite a few years. Yeah, you could then scale up. So yeah, the willingness to pay is expressed in a per year. So yeah, you multiply the number of years that you get from the drug. I actually don't know. I think.
But Paul, can I follow up on that? And suppose there's one drug treats 20,000 patients, the other treats 20 million patients. And
yes.
And you're still following this dollars per quality model. Doesn't that sort of take you into a range where there's some massive payouts for some products and some smaller payouts for other products?
Oh, sure. Yeah, if you're playing that game, then you're going to obviously, scale up the amount, the total budget will be scaled up by the number of people using the therapy. Sure. So if there's a high volume drug like a Lipitor, then obviously you're going to be paying more because there's a lot of people using it than if it's a small volume drug with the same quality advantage.
Do you think after a company, and I'll let other people ask more questions, but do you think after a company has earned a certain number of $1 billion, you could call it a day in terms of the incentive?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the companies, you know, the companies will tell you that they face a skewed distribution of returns on their investments, right? They have a few blockbusters that earn massive revenues, which pay for the failures and pay for the drugs that are commercially, dead in the water, that don't do very well commercially. So, yeah, I guess it depends on the extent to which there's cross-subsidization of the crappy, the unsuccessful drugs and the low-volume drugs. It goes to the issue of, I think, of how you want to support your R&D enterprise. I mean, the current system, I think, is not ideal. There could be some improvements made to the way we publicly support R&D.
What as an economist, what data would you like to see in terms of the cost of drug to match up what you have on the benefits of drugs once they're in the market that would allow you to model incentives better?
Well, I think what we have to think about is the extent to which information I would like to get is we are supporting as a society the drug discovery enterprise. Yeah. How are we doing it? Well, obviously we're offering IP. Yes, that's a benefit to the industry. It's not a natural God-given right. This is something that we're giving them. We're also giving them tax credits for R&D. We're giving them higher sales revenues for certain populations that we cover through drug plans who otherwise would have low demand. We're offering them, public subsidies of the basic research. NIH spends a lot of money on the basic research, which helps, obviously, which is complementary to their efforts. Given the amount of money we're spending, could we do a better job? Could we think of channeling the cash in a different way that we get more, and just better drugs per dollar, or we can, can we think about ways of paying, and this has been discussed in literature, and Jamie, I know you've been active in this as well. You've been talking about reward schemes. You've been talking about, there's been talk about having some public subsidy for clinical trials. There's been talk amongst some members having public support of these drug discovery consortia, which would, which public sector laboratories would partner with industry to do the basic research required to get drugs that have a better chance of clearing clinical trials. This would involve more work in target validation, predictive modeling, better, ways of getting drugs to the parts of the body which are in ways that are, more effective. So there's a whole. The current system it's kind of opaque. Unfortunately, it's hard to change, but you can think about alternative ways of rewarding this enterprise. If we're going to stick in the same system, yeah, I don't really know if I haven't really thought about the question as to how much revenue is enough. I mean, obviously we have, if you're paying for drugs from a public fund, you have to consider the opportunity cost of money spent on drugs. Yes, there are other.
Well, let me just phrase it a little differently. Like Herceptin was generating about $6 billion per year. I think Gleevec was generating about 3 or 4, maybe $4 billion a year.
Yeah.
So I think I forget whether Gleevec earned 30 or 40 billion dollars over the course of that product. It was really initially funded by charities and the NIH in terms of the early work on it. Most of the clinical trials qualified for the orphan drug tax credit, 50% tax credit. I just feel like if it was another industry and you were paying, if Boeing built an airplane and there was just some unlimited cap on how much money they could make on providing input, it seems like somebody would start asking some questions as to at what point have you paid for, is the incentive really enter that range where you're just basically paying more than you should for what you're for.
These are all reds. Yeah.
But
That's a good question. I don't really know. I mean, that question is wrapped up in the entire question about how we want to support this R&D enterprise. And some of these companies are earning a lot of rent, and then what do they do with that money? Is it being used in the way that we find appropriate to spend more? Is that being used to invest in new drug development in ways that we want them to? Good question. I mean, if you talk to people like Frank Lichtenberg and Thomas Philipson and economists who are more sympathetic to the industry, they'll tell you that, well, you look at the first iPhone or the first iPod, right? These companies earned a lot of money from their initial product offering, and they got a big payoff, but then the price went down, right? Now you have different music players and different cell phones at a much more reasonable cost, or for the same price you get much more quality. So they'll say that these things naturally work themselves out, that if there's a big pot of money to be made, companies will compete for it. Whether or not that competition happens in pharmaceuticals in the same way that you see for iPhones is different, and maybe it's a question.
Well, I think you can choose between an iPhone and an Android phone. You can't always choose between one drug and another.
Yes, that's true. I mean, maybe not initially, but look at the Hep C space. We see a lot of companies trying to get a piece of the action, don't we? No, I mean, how many different therapies exist for these new curative therapies for hepatitis C?
At present, FDA approved.
Yeah, I mean, more than one.
Yeah, I think 2 right now. Maybe more tomorrow. Yeah. No, but I think so. I think robust rewards is I think what people would like to see for development of new products, right? But is there any point when robust is sort of stops being the right word?
Yeah, I can imagine the company would, just would earn these massive rents in the same way that, Kobe Bryant is able to make a ton of money just by being Kobe Bryant. I mean, there's only so many people like him in the world, and as long as he's producing baskets and filling up a Lakers stadium, I guess Staples Center, he's making tons of cash. Yeah, so depends on the degree of competition for people like him. Willingness to pay. If you can imagine that the payers would be, if they have some sway or market power, you could imagine them saying, okay, enough's enough. We're reducing our prices and take it or leave it.
Okay.
Gail has a question, I think.
Let me make sure again. There you go.
Okay, well, it's just following up on what's...
Gail, could you introduce yourself first?
Oh, yeah, my name is Gail Krikorian. Until very recently, I was working as an advisor on intellectual property issues at the European Parliament for the Greens. And I'm currently working with NGOs in France on the whole debate of prices and the new health law, and we are trying to push some amendments on that. And so to just follow up on what was being said, the situation we're in here is that there is a monopoly, so we cannot really count on competition to regulate the price. So I was wondering, because like you said, Jamie, the situation with phones is not exactly the same situation as with medicine. On one hand, because phones, you can have sort of a competition, and also it's not exactly the same thing at stake. So I was wondering, is there some kind of similar environment in terms of monopoly situation where there is price caps, where government put price caps?
Sure. I mean, if it's a pure monopoly, then we've seen in the past governments have profit taxes. The UK government, if I understand correctly, has a rate of return regulation scheme, so that if you are a company in the fortunate position to be having a blockbuster that nobody can copy, that there's no competition for, the prices are held in check by virtue of the allowable rate of return. So, yeah, there are government does have tools. In some jurisdictions, they have tools to limit. I guess it's a cost regulation, is it not? Or it's a form of cost regulation. Yeah. Rate of return, because the government.
Examples, and because I don't think the UK has been very successful with that piece of law. France have a mechanism that is a little bit similar, where companies are supposed to reimburse some money if they exceed a certain level of income.
Yeah.
That's also not really working. So I was wondering, if there is other examples of other type of markets where there are practices from government of putting actual price cap. I think in Europe we discussed price cap in the context of roaming for telephones.
Okay.
But I don't know very well the situation, and I was just wondering if you or somebody else in the discussion today has ideas.
Well, Joel just had a comment that he has some insights into the New Zealand system. I mean, Joel, do you want to have a go?
Sure. So, sorry, I'll introduce myself first. My name's Joel Lection. I'm currently sitting in Sydney, Australia, and I teach health policy in Toronto. As Paul said, we've worked together before. New Zealand, back in '92, was faced with a situation where drug costs were going up at about 15% a year. And they got very aggressive in terms of regulating expenditures. So first of all, they have a cap, an annual cap on public drug cost spending.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not an open-ended budget. They set us a particular amount, and they don't go above that. They use reference-based pricing. This is on therapeutic reference-based pricing. In other words, the drugs don't have to be generics. They just have to be similar enough in treating the same disease. And so they price things what they will pay at the lowest price. And if a company wants to introduce a new drug, a new patented drug in New Zealand, what they will often do is they will say, all right, you can introduce that drug, but then you have to lower the price of an existing drug, and you have to lower it below the reference price we're currently paying. So they now have a new, even lower reference base for that group of drugs. So according to the New Zealand figures that I've seen from Pharmac, if they hadn't introduced this scheme back in '92, they would be paying about 2.8 billion New Zealand dollars a year on drugs, and I think, in fact, they're paying about 900 million New Zealand dollars. So they've cut projected costs by about 2/3.
Mm-hmm.
They also do other things, so they have tendering for generics, a variety of different mechanisms. But then New Zealand, as a country of 4.5 million people, basically decided that the pharmaceutical industry was never going to invest in any significant way in that country, and so they didn't care what kind of threats the industry made about pulling out of the country. So that very aggressive type of expenditure controls may not work in countries where the pharmaceutical industry currently plays a major economic role.
Yes. Well, Canada would be a little bit different. from New Zealand in respect of our ability to, like, we'd be more sensitive, I think, to the level of investment by industry. That being said, we have one of the lowest ratios of R&D spend to sales revenues of any country. I think the PMP-RB report puts us close to dead last amongst the comparators that they look at. So it's possible that we could just be more aggressive and say, damn the torpedoes, let's just price regulate, and if they don't want to play ball here, they don't play ball. Yeah, that's certainly something that we can consider, although the lobbying and the there would be hell to pay, but yeah, it's certainly an option. Going back to the issue, though, of the UK's success at using this rate of return regulation, I do know that from the PMPRB figures and the data I showed you this morning on that slide, we do have, like, UK spends about the same amount of money that we do on prescription drugs, and their market is much bigger, right? So their per capita spending on prescription meds is a fraction of what we spend in Canada, and that has to be due in part to their regulatory efforts.
Could I throw something out just on methodology, on the way to think about drug pricing? Suppose you started with the idea that a government was going to offer X amount of $1 billion as incentives for drug development.
Yes.
Whatever that number was, as part of the budget, and the feeling was that we care about, for whatever reasons, we want to incentivize, but what we're thinking is we're going to give say $30 billion out or $10 billion out or whatever for the size of the country the number is.
Yes.
And then if they were to then model something about the way the discovery process works, and then look at things such as what are the risks of going from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 on the one hand, what are the size of the trials that you typically see according to what the regulators look at when they approve the drugs, what they sort of expect the cost of the trials are, based on also third-party information on the cost of doing trials by a patient and that sort of thing. So you have some sort of cost of the inputs in there.
Mm-hmm.
You also have some sense of whether it's a bit of a stochastic process. I mean, the companies not only do not know whether drugs will succeed from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, they don't know whether the drugs, in some cases, will be used to treat what indications they will. I mean, sometimes drugs develop for one indication, they end up working for a different indication.
Sure.
They have all this sort of uncertainty. And so if you just sort of accept the idea that it's an imperfect process like that with all the risk, if you were to run, I know that Chase Perfect is here. He was working on, he's going to present a paper today where he's looking at drug pricing from the point of view of the company, doing some Monte Carlo simulations as to how they might perceive different scenarios lay out. Why don't you just sort of model different scenarios of what the prices would be for different kinds of outcomes on the R&D thing, and play around with it a bit to see which sort of system maximizes the supply of innovation given the amount of money you want to spend. I mean, there was why just sort of sit back and say, shit, I don't know anything. I guess we can't decide anything. Let's let the companies just charge whatever they want, and then maybe kind of start with that assumption and then work back. I'm not even sure how you work back from that assumption, but then as opposed to sort of saying like, what set of prices, what sort of price signals could we set that would, on reasonable assumptions about the risks and the cost on the front end, maximize the health outcomes we want from our point of view. I mean, isn't that the right way to think about structuring prices? So you might have not entirely a linear relationship between health benefits and what the payoff is, depending on the number of patients, for example, that benefit from a product. Or you might have other nuances you may want to introduce into it.
So Jamie, just to be clear, you're suggesting a system by which we pay for performance, and Like you get rewarded in proportion to the health gains produced by your new drug?
Not necessarily, but what I'm saying is that a system where the starting point is that you have a certain amount of money to spend in terms of rewarding innovation, and you try and imagine a pricing system.
Yeah.
Let's just take high volume versus low volume drugs.
Okay.
You could say that both high and low volume drugs get exactly the same amount per quality benefit.
Yes.
All right, that's what some people propose. A different scenario would be that you would have some kind of nonlinear payoff on qualities, for example, that ones with smaller client populations would get more money per quality, and ones with higher things with more. And suppose you compared those two scenarios and ask yourself, what are sort of the expected outcomes in terms of the rate of innovation for both kinds of drugs and things like that? I mean, if you sort of start it from that kind of scenario where you model it like that, then you at least kind of know why you were doing things. Why were you picking one policy over the other policy? Because you'd be sort of simulating with some data points that you'd sort of simulate what you thought it would produce in terms of the rate of innovation. You could even have different policies on drugs that are second or third in a class versus first in a class. You could have things that are where the benefits extend beyond the expected patent term, like an antibiotic, where you wanted to have conservation of the resource or something like that. I mean, you can imagine a more elaborate system than just the linear system, for example.
Oh, sure. You could imagine that. I mean, your premise, Jamie, is excellent. I mean, the idea of trying to simulate the behavior of the industry, given the price signals and rewards that you offer as a government or a regulator, is excellent. As long as you have sufficiently good data on, how they will respond, you could, how they're going to prioritize their R&D, what kind of things they'll be investigating.
Well, yeah. I mean, suppose, for example, that that your model is that a company will do something if the expected profits are positive, and will not do them if the expected profits are negative. And so you had some sense of how much it cost to do things and what the risks were. And there's a lot of data actually on risk now, but also how risks have evolved over things. I think if you look at orphan drugs, for example, when the government eliminated the 50% tax credit, people took shorter odds on orphan drugs than when the tax credit was there. When the clinical trials were subsidized by 50%, were willing to accept longer odds. In other words, they were willing to make more risky investments in the development than when the trials were not subsidized. So there are data points where you can kind of look at how people do in fact respond. But I mean, it would be how given changes in the prices, what could you expect in terms of the not only the rate of investment but the rate of outcome? Sometimes the rate of investment itself is constrained by the march of what's happening in the science. Like what's happening right now, I think, in Hep C is because there's been a movement in basic science about how hepatitis C has been treated, that involved a lot of public sector research and a lot of company research. But cumulatively, when the science got to a certain point, just like with the so-called NIBs and the MABs for cancer treatments and things like that, when these sort of certain things take place on therapies, then you see a proliferation of drugs just kind of coming out of nowhere because the science has kind of advanced things.
Yes. I mean, this would be a pretty difficult task, right? I mean, you'd have to do it properly, I suspect. You have to model how the science is progressing, the basic science, and that presumably is a function of the level of public support by the major funding agencies, including NIH and the equivalent agencies in the EU and Japan. And how is that science evolving? Is that science actionable on the part of industry? Can they actually use those advances to formulate their own drugs? So that's even there's technical possibilities there. And then figure out what is the pricing scheme that you're considering, and how would that incentivize R&D activity, right? I mean, you mentioned things like you get more money if you're a first in class than if you're a second in class. So you would have, you can imagine there would be some races, there'd be some acceleration of R&D programs to be first, not second, if there's a race. You know, it would presumably these things are all modelable in principle. I don't see why you couldn't do it. I'd be interested in what your colleague has to say later on this afternoon. It does sound like an interesting approach. Of course, you got to think about the as well. You'd have to consider you wouldn't really worry about what Canada's doing. I mean, we're such a bit player in the world stage. We're 2.6% of the world market. We're roughly the same size as UK. What you really worry about is obviously the US, Japan, and I guess the EU market, or big like France and Germany.
You say that, but if you look at what happens in trade agreements or in pricing, when Canada does something, or Germany does something, or the UK does something, or Australia, whatever, I mean, other countries often sort of follow the lead on that thing, right? There's whether it's soft norms or hard norms for trade agreements, you do see collections of what I mean, I think right now there's a lot of similarities between what Canada is doing, what Australia is doing, and what the UK is doing, right? Within other European countries, if I could follow the language a little bit better, I might have a better appreciation of that. But I don't think you have to be the United States to sort of influence things.
Well, true. I mean, there's a lot of international learning, and countries will emulate each other's policies to some degree. But at the end of the day, what makes investment decisions? The investment decision is going to turn on the revenue flows. Yes, the expected revenue flows, and those revenue flows will come primarily from the major markets, and the U.S. is by far the biggest market, and the EU market.
It is true that if you eliminated patents in Canada, it would not have a first-order effect on drug development, and yet you do not observe Canada eliminating patents on Canada. In fact, they, as you pointed out,
that's true though. But it's not for. It's not because that's for other reasons. That's because if we tended to do that again, like we did in '69, there would be retaliatory effects. Like we wouldn't, they wouldn't. U.S. won't buy our lumber or whatever. I mean, it's not really an R&D story. It's more, we want you to pay your fair share story, or we don't want Canada to set a bad example story. We don't want you to inspire the Brazilians to not pay, or South Africans. It's about being a good citizen of the global order.
Well, if that's true, then developing a model which has an intellectual appeal and can be defended on policy grounds, not just as free riding, but as being a better way to think about stimulating innovation.
Sure.
More defensible in terms of protecting your lumber industry.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's no reason that we can't be a thought leader in this area and say, if you're willing to appeal to reason and rationality, which is not always the case when it comes to policy discussions, but if you're able to do that, yeah, you could say, well, to the extent you can within the current trade agreements. I mean, it's hard to. I mean, you're constrained in so many ways by what you've already agreed to. Yes, as part of the TRIPS or as part of the CETA agreement or other agreements which are in the works. I mean, how many degrees of freedom do you have to maneuver in ways in which you can implement novel reimbursement structures? Maybe you can't. Maybe you can. As well, I mean, there's no. At the end of the day, in Canada, the federal government is the one setting the IP rules, but it's the provincial governments who are paying for the drugs, right? The provinces don't really give a shit about, intellectual property or innovation. They care about what they pay for the drugs. They have no horse in the race for innovation policy, but it's so fragmented, right? There's no single body which can say, okay, here's what we're going to do. Here's our objective. Here's where we stand in the international order. We're a small market, but we want to have it, out of principle, have a policy which others would try to emulate. Like, it doesn't happen that way because there's so many different stakeholders that play in this market. There's drug payers, there's public, there's private, and amongst the public, there's many different public plans, right? There's in the federal government, you have the Industry Canada, which is setting the IP rules, but you have other other jurisdictions which are not in support of that, perhaps. So it's just there's no monolithic policymaker there's no benevolent dictator who can really carry the day. And plus, the federal government doesn't really, they have enough things on their plate, right? These things are always vying for the policy agenda has always got more things than they can actually get done, right? They only have so many hours in the day, Parliament only sits so many days. We just had a major change to the food and drug safety regulations, which have not been updated since the 1920s, right? I mean, these things in Canada simply don't happen because there's, in the ways you see in the States, well, I'm not a political scientist, but it seems to be so difficult to get to actually execute the kinds of policies that you would like to see if you're, the principal policy where we want to reward IP based on this and this and change the system. There's too many moving parts and there's too many other priorities, I think, in Canada. Maybe Joel can speak to the difficulties of getting the food and drug safety, the Food and Drug Act changed, but it took forever. Right, Joel?
Whole other topic, Paul.
Yeah.
So I would just like to say I think right now we're going to sort of wind down this particular thing, but I'd like to give people here who are who've been participating remotely as well as Paul for a chance to make some sort of concluding comments before we do that. And I just wonder if there's anybody that's out there that has been listening to the presentation today and remotely, if they would like to make a comment or ask any more questions before we do this. Everybody's fine? Okay. Well then, Paul, I think, don't you think Paul's done a great job today?
Oh yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, I don't think this could have been a better first seminar for us. And you've been a great sport when we've had these technical problems getting the thing started, and we got off to a late start and everything like that. And I think Claire, could you show Claire a bit here?
The whole time.
Put yourself on, Claire. Claire has been the technician for the whole event, and she's been also the person that's been sort of making the video. So I'd like to thank you all. But Paul, I'd like to give you the last word, and if you'd like to share any thoughts going forward about, and also we would hope that sometime we could have you as a participant asking questions of some of the other when we do some of the other people that we invite into on this series on drug pricing we're going to do.
Well, I want to say first of all thank you to the organizers for this. I think it's a really interesting idea to just talk about these things and just to be able to take ideas which in my head are kind of free floating and they're not really formalized, but just to put them out there and then see what you guys think and vice versa. I'd love to be able to continue doing this. I mean, I have an interest in the in pharmaceutical R&D. I think it's incredibly important. Obviously, if you look at the Hep C drugs, they've made a difference to a lot of people. So I care about that, and I want to see the drug industry do more and more things. But I think it could be a force. It's a force for good, and it could be improves people's welfare. So I'm excited about it. But obviously, there's difficulties. There's coordination problems, and there's incentive problems which have to be overcome to fully realize the benefits. So on that note, I thank you, and yeah. If you want to email me any other thoughts, I think my email address might be available somewhere. If it's not, you can Google Paul Grootendorst and you'll find my website.
And also, with your permission, we'll put the slides up if you're all right with that.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And so we're going to sign off now.
Okay. Good day.
Thank you.
Bye.